Picture the scene. Lucas, a sharp-dressed lawyer from Sao Paulo, rushes into that small hospital, icy gaze pinned to his official papers. He doesn't even notice the tense atmosphere until, out of nowhere, he comes face to face with Clara. She's in the thick of a crisis, hands steady as she holds on to a family's hope, when Lucas, a little lost, announces the eviction order loud enough for everyone to hear. Silence falls. Clara's calm eyes turn to storm. No one had ever been so blunt. Not now. Here, lives are at stake. You could tell a war had just begun. He, used to winning in courtrooms, she, never letting anyone slip away to death. And it's impossible not to wonder, will he ever manage to break through her walls? Behind that cold facade, could he be a man capable of change? If you want to know how far a guarded heart might go for someone who never gives up, keep close. This story is just beginning. The city felt frozen in time. It was early, but the heat was already pressing down, sticking to skin, seeping into every thought. Lucas parked the rental car right in front of the old square, under a crooked tree, as if even it had given up on shade that January morning. He stepped out, adjusting his navy blue tie smooth, not a single thread out of place, trying not to show how much the sweat down his neck bothered him, especially under that flawless dress shirt. His expensive watch gleamed, almost outshining the hushed movement of the streets. He looked around, expecting crowds, noise, all those things that filled his Sao Paulo routine. But here, there was only thick silence, part curiosity, part suspicion. The stares began even before he closed the car door. An old woman sitting on a bench clutched her bag of vegetables and stared. 3 high schoolers in uniform whispered, glancing sideways, probably trying to guess how many reis that suit cost, those dark shoes that didn't match the uneven cobblestone streets at all. He already knew this reaction by heart. The stranger. The outsider. Only, it never stung quite like it did in that moment. As he walked through the center, Lucas felt every step drawing someone's attention, from open windows, from the tiny shops squeezed beneath faded awnings. A scrawny dog slept outside the bakery, ignoring everything, as if used to the world spinning on without hurry. The scent of strong coffee and fresh bread tried to overcome the promise of rain rising from the hot earth. The hospital facade was simple, but someone took the time to care for the garden. Daisies and carnations mingled in crooked flower beds. The walls were stained with age, but the windows shone clean. Lucas ran a hand through his hair, not noticing how childish the gesture was, like he was asking for courage, and went inside. The receptionist, a woman in her early 20s, tried to smile but couldn't quite manage. She lingered a little too long searching for his name on the visitors list, even though deep down, she knew who he was. It was impossible not to. The lawyer. The one who'd come to take away the hospital, the town's small pride. Deep down, Lucas had mastered the posture, straight back, squared shoulders, serious expression, that studied neutrality he'd learned to wear in times of crisis. But there, in those narrow hallways, his footsteps echoed too much. Every rustle of paper, every cough in the corridor, it was like the whole place hushed when he passed. Were they waiting for him, or just waiting to see the end of what was left there? He caught himself noticing details. The message board covered with colorful notes, birthday photos, children grinning with thinning hair, patients, or maybe staff kids, he wasn't sure. He spotted Dona Lourdes' name on the wall, the late head nurse. There was an old trophy photo and a fish tank, now empty, beside it. A worker set the chairs straight in the waiting area, pretending not to notice Lucas watching her reflection in the glass. In the director's office, all Lucas could focus on were the little things holding the place together. The hand-stitched curtain, the chipped mug with the smell of herbal tea, boxes of medicine sitting on an old wooden shelf. The director was a white-haired man with a gentle voice, but his narrowed eyes made it clear it wasn't just exhaustion. He explained things quickly, almost as if determined to cut the meeting short. Lucas responded politely, but each word felt weighted. Here, no legal argument could convince anyone that change was an opportunity. Tension charged every encounter. Tired people in plain uniforms, but their eyes were all the same, bracing for the blow, suspicious of every word. Stepping out of the office, Lucas got himself lost in the corridors, searching for the meeting room. He paused by the staff break room. The door was open, and for a moment, Lucas heard a muffled laugh, quickly smothered by hushed voices. He hadn't seen Clara yet, but he already sensed the weight of a different presence in there, the way everyone seemed wary, but also protective of something he couldn't see. Deep down, Lucas wondered, almost without wanting to, why that place bothered him so much. It was just another case, another lucrative contract. He remembered his colleagues promising bonuses, international projects, his name in magazines. It was all rational. He was rational. But on that stifling day, there was no sense in feeling so brittle inside. He headed to the break room for coffee, trying to blend in. Out of the corner of his ear, he heard an older man mutter, "That young man's here to auction off our hope, that's all." Another replied with a bitter chuckle, "Next thing, he'll want a prescription." Lucas pretended not to hear, even though every word burned more than the sun outside. He looked out the window. The square was empty, the swing at a standstill. He wanted to loosen his shirt, rip off the tie, just be another person there. Someone who feels, who fails, who doesn't have anything to prove. But that wasn't allowed for him. Not there. Not with the name he bore. In that small-town silence, Lucas realized that however prepared he felt, he had no idea what it meant to truly belong somewhere. His loneliness rang loud through that hot morning, woven of cautious kindness in the eyes of people who wanted security, not promises. He realized that more than a fight over contracts, it was a struggle for the right to exist. And for the first time in ages, he wasn't sure he was ready to be the villain in this story. The hospital hallway smelled of antiseptic and old coffee. That harsh white light leaked down from the ceiling, shining over tired faces. Lucas hurried on, clipboard and documents in hand, sure stride, expensive shoes tapping out sharp notes on the battered floor. He didn't even notice the gurney go by. Didn't see the receptionist's red eyes, glued to the official-looking paper in his hand, as if it were poison. All he wanted was to get it over with. Sign, deliver, leave. The ER door was half open. A muffled voice urged calm. He took a deep breath. He'd heard it all in Sao Paulo. Shouts, threats, nothing ever fazed him. He pushed the door open with a swift flick. He stepped in. Inside, chaos. Doctors in white coats, people coughing, an old man hunched in a wheelchair, a child wailing in a young woman's arms. But time only truly stopped for the woman standing in the center of the room. Hair pulled back any old way, bangs stuck to her forehead with sweat. Lab coat flecked with dried blood and a stain that could have been coffee or medicine. And her eyes. Steady, direct, holding the whole room together as if it would fall apart otherwise. Clara. She didn't even have to speak. Just raised a hand, quick, halting the step Lucas was taking toward the gurney. Silence collapsed over them. For an instant, the beeping of machines was the only living thing. Lucas realized, too late, where he was. He opened his mouth to say something, but the paper in his hand became suddenly heavy. He just wanted to deliver it, that was all. Do his job. But there, in that scene, everything felt completely wrong. It felt off, even to him, a man used to rooms thick with anxiety, but never this kind. Clara didn't take her eyes off him. Please. Her voice wasn't loud, but carried a force Lucas honestly didn't expect. In here, what matters is who's alive, or who still can be saved. Maybe it was shame, maybe arrogance, but Lucas raised the document, hand extended. He hesitated. He could feel every pair of eyes against him, the ponytailed doctor, the orderly in blue scrubs, even the security guard leaning by the door. The contempt was almost physical, something heavy. Eyes of people who've lost too much already. Who look at a stranger and know he's just here to announce that they're about to lose even more. The child coughed, loudly. Clara didn't budge. She just drew in a breath, like she needed all her strength not to scream. Can you give us that paper later? Only then did Lucas notice she was trembling. It wasn't fear. It was contained fury. He hesitated. Not because he was afraid of her, but because, for a second, he felt like an intruder. Not just in the room. In these people's lives. He considered arguing that the meeting was scheduled, that he needed to follow protocol, that he wasn't here by choice. But none of those phrases carried any weight in that room. His hand hovered awkwardly. He forced his arm not to show his uncertainty. But it was useless, he knew. The whole room saw, even the old man with vacant eyes saw it. Clara took a single step toward him. Just one. Everything about her seemed taut, from her jaw to her fingertips. You know the difference between that paper and what we do? She flicked her gaze to the boy beside her, then back to Lucas. The boy was coughing harder now. That paper doesn't feel. It doesn't beg for its mother to come back. It doesn't pray for the pain to go away. It doesn't cry at night. It won't remember you. But the people will. Lucas felt the suit heavy on his body. Suddenly, it was suffocating. He clutched his folder to his chest, crossed his arms. Searched for comfort in words that, for the first time in years, wouldn't come. He felt almost ashamed, a pinch of exhaustion, a flicker of self-disgust. A doctor looked like he was about to speak. The silence grew heavier with each second Lucas stayed, out of place. The old walls, the stained ceiling, every single detail seemed to want him gone. On Clara's face, a tear threatened, but didn't fall. Her eyes shimmered only for a moment, but she resisted. Didn't let anyone see, not even him, though he'd noticed. She turned back to the gurney, resumed her instructions, hands gentle but steady on the patient's shoulders. Lucas stood there, paper in hand, trying to tell himself it was still just a job. But inside, he felt his defenses beginning to crack. Every word that day stuck in his throat. As he turned to leave, he heard someone murmur. It wasn't an insult, it was pity. The kind that burns. Outside, the rain started to drum hard on the windows. The foggy glass blurred out the streetlights. Lucas looked back at the document, the printed letters already smudged, as if they belonged to another world. He thought of his own son. Pictured the boy, fragile, one day needing someone in his corner, too. That night, long before he practiced any speech, Lucas stood in the parking lot, breathing in the smell of wet grass, chest tight with silence. It wasn't just shame. It was the feeling of having crossed a boundary, his own. And as she looked through the hospital window, Clara took a deep breath, trying to shake off the bitter aftertaste of that encounter. She wondered if, maybe, the hardest people around were the ones most desperately hiding a call for help behind a sheet of paperwork. Nobody said a word for a while after the door closed. Clara braced one hand against the counter, as if her body might give out. On the other, there were still smears of blood from that boy who'd nearly died moments earlier, someone Lucas barely even noticed, too focused on delivering his envelope. Now all he wanted was to leave. But turning his back would have been too much of a cowardly act. The tension hung so thick in the air you could almost hear it. The blur of people hustling down the halls, muffled crying from just outside the door. In a hospital, that sound never really disappears. But for a few seconds, it felt like everything was suspended. Lucas tried to compose himself. He was the kind who learned to breathe deep even on the witness stand. So that's where he started. He fixed his jacket sleeve, slipped the paper under his arm, and willed his voice not to falter. "Believe me, I didn't come here to be disrespectful. I'm just doing my duty," he said, too cold, as if that would erase the evidence of his mistake. But he saw in her eyes it made no difference. Clara turned to face him. Her face was tired, pale in the harsh light. Her hair, a little loose from its bun, her coat stained with coffee. She had a calm manner, but in her voice there was a force that knocked anyone off guard. "Mr. Lawyer, this duty of yours has names, surnames, and stories. I don't know how many people have agreed to take a paper like this from you, but here it's not going to be like that. Not in front of someone fighting not to die." Lucas clenched his jaw, wishing for words that might sound kinder, but everything inside him seemed to fall apart. He'd always believed protecting the rules was the best he could do. But now, the ground felt different beneath his feet. "With all due respect, Dr. Clara," he started, but choked. Why was it so hard to find the right phrases? "I need to make sure everyone understands what's happening. I'm just here for the facts." She took a deep breath. Her eyes, red from exhaustion, seemed to accuse and plead at once. "Then come on. Let me show you a fact." Clara walked to the door, caught his eye, motioned for Lucas to follow. He hesitated, pride surging, but something in him said it was better to go along. They walked the corridor together, past people lying on gurneys, sad-faced companions, a child coughing in a plastic chair. The two of them passed close enough to almost brush shoulders, too near to be just adversaries. Lucas, half by accident, noticed how she bumped his shoulder, maybe as a reminder of who was really in charge in those halls. They stopped in front of room 12. Clara opened the door softly. Inside, an elderly woman, eyes closed, looking so tired, and beside her, a boy with his face pressed to the window pane, drawing shapes with his finger. "That's Dona Mercedes, 72. She saw this hospital built. The boy there lost his father last month in an accident. All they want is someone to stay by their side, even if it won't fix everything. Can you understand that?" This time, Lucas didn't know what to say. He felt the weight of the lawsuit in his pocket. He wanted to explain, say he was not against anyone, that he was only doing what he'd been sent to do. But all those words shrank beside what he saw. "I have to keep things in order, doctor. Not everything is up to me," he tried still, but his own voice sounded unfamiliar, smaller than usual. Clara didn't smile, but her face softened just a little. "It is up to you. The way you choose to look at people is always a choice." Silence again, broken only by the distant beep of some monitor. Lucas stood there, hard hammering, not out of fear of losing the case or failing, but a sudden knowledge that something fundamental was off in the way he moved through the world, and only now was it coming clear. In that instant, he thought about backing out. The smell of ether, of sweat, of hope struggling to survive in this hospital was like a warning. All of a sudden, everything felt closer, more human. Lucas fumbled with his papers, wanting to show off his knowledge of the law. But before the sleeping old woman and the boy drawing invisible stars, the law had nothing to offer. Clara turned to leave, but paused at the door. She looked straight at him again, at once firm and vulnerable. "You're really going to tell all these people that their hospital's going to close? Just like that? That they're going to lose even this? I hope you'll think hard before you act on that order. Sometimes following orders is the worst thing anyone can do." Lucas stood awkwardly, not knowing what to do. The corridor felt cold now. Somewhere outside, someone was screaming for help, but the lawyer didn't budge. Looking at Clara's back, he realized she wasn't just carrying a cause, but all those people too. And he, always certain he could handle any pressure, felt all the blood rise to his face. Clara, on her way out, didn't slam the door. She just let it close softly, with a creak that sounded like a warning. Alone, Lucas looked again at the old woman and the boy. He thought of his own son, the one he saw only every other weekend. Remembered the divorce and all those times he'd run from an honest conversation. The corridor's voices swelled again, tangled with the smell of reheated soup and bone-deep exhaustion. The suit, so crisp in Sao Paulo, now felt heavy with heat and shame. Lucas closed his eyes for a moment and wished, just this once, he didn't have to be the lawyer everyone expected. He stayed there until he felt he'd suffocate if he didn't get out for a breath of air. When he finally crossed back down the hall, he kept his eyes down, not meeting anyone's gaze. And for the first time in a long time, in that small thrown-together hospital, Lucas wanted, deeply, to apologize. It's strange how a hospital hallway can sometimes feel like a world of silence all its own. At first, Lucas thought it was just another cold building, smelling of antiseptic, with dull white walls and that ever-too-bright fluorescent lighting for anyone coming in from the sun-soaked street. But lately, he'd begun noticing different sounds in that same space. Hurried footsteps answering a call, the fast breathing of a patient behind the door, the quiet crying of a family huddled on a plastic chair. He lingered by the water cooler, pretending to read some papers from his folder. Really, he wasn't reading anything. He only watched Clara, across the hall, tucking a blanket around an elderly woman. Every movement was measured, gentle. The kind of care you rarely see, even for those who work in such places every day. What bothered Lucas most was the urge to keep watching. Someone like him, used to locking eyes with witnesses in court until they cracked, now found himself hoping not to be noticed by a nurse doing her rounds. He couldn't quite explain his interest, telling himself it was professional, that he needed to study routines, spot errors for the case. Only, that didn't feel true anymore. That morning, the hospital was busier than usual. A fine rain started tapping at the window, thickening by the minute. Clara moved quickly through her rounds, but when she paused to check a boy's chart by the gurney, she pushed her glasses up and, without noticing, traced her finger under her eye as if banishing tiredness. He saw the tension in her brow. Then, when the kid started to shiver, maybe scared of a shot, Clara knelt beside him, whispered something so soft he couldn't hear, but the boy managed a shy smile, the kind that slips away with the next pang of pain. The quiet between them was so deep Lucas could almost feel both their hearts beating. Lucas thought about his own childhood, how his father told him to be tough, never betray fear, a world apart from Clara's way of gentleness. Again, he realized his own shoulders were drawn tight, old habit, as if to shield himself from something he couldn't see. He tried not to act on the urge to come closer, but it happened anyway. He walked slowly up the hall and stopped as Clara stood from the gurney and crossed his path. Their eyes met for a moment. It was the kind of look that lasts less than 2 seconds, but says everything. Clara didn't smile, but there was no disdain now, like there'd been before. She just watched him, as if, in that gaze, she was asking, "What are you still doing here?" Lucas didn't answer, just nodded, because that was all he could match to her steadiness. She hesitated for a fleeting second as she passed, as if thinking of saying more, but let it go. The silence was so tangible Lucas found himself embarrassed to be just standing there, with no suit of arguments to hide behind. He began to notice too much in these little things. How Clara would squeeze a patient's hand through the worst of the pain, how she gave soft-spoken instructions to the student nurses, always careful not to expose anyone. Near the end of her shift, Clara showed up suddenly next to Lucas, who was still puzzling over his notes in a hard chair. She got right to the point, not aggressive, just clear. "I need this eviction paperwork not to interfere with care. People here have nowhere else to go." Her tone was quiet but unyielding. It was obvious it was no plea, it was a boundary. Lucas wanted to respond in kind, to explain he was just the messenger. But the look in her eyes stripped him bare on the spot. There was exhaustion and hope mingled there, something he'd not seen in any Sao Paulo colleague for a long time. He spoke quietly, stumbling. "I'm only playing my part." But then he stopped himself, because it sounded like cowardice. Clara didn't argue. She just raised her eyebrow, shrugged, and walked away, but as she left, she looked back, as if still waiting for something from him, any reaction at all. On the way back to his hotel, Lucas mentally replayed it all, feeling a new discomfort, something halfway between admiration and regret. The rain pounded harder, splattering his briefcase and muddying the dirt road, erasing his own tracks. He was never the introspective type. But there was no denying, in that silent exchange of glances, something about Clara made the world less sharp, less predictable, and, oddly, almost welcoming. Late that afternoon, he returned to the hospital, pretending he needed a signature, just to see her again. He found Clara beside a pregnant woman, going over every medication and risk in calm detail, unhurried. They exchanged few words, but their trust was evident. When Clara stood up, she crossed the corridor and paused for a second near Lucas. Another silent look. Sometimes, he wanted to say everything to have her know his days were also weighed down by pain and fear, even if hidden deep. But all that came was a hushed good night. Clara looked at him like someone fluent in silences, someone who'd solved many problems without words. In that moment, Lucas realized, deep down, that he was starting to miss the hospital, without really understanding why. Maybe because of her. Maybe because of all the stories that would never fit in a court case. Or maybe because, in that corridor, unlike almost everywhere else in his life, something made him feel it wasn't too late to learn how to care. That night, everything inside the hospital seemed slower. Outside, the street was just a strip of darkness, a few lanterns scattered here and there, and the gentle rain tapping on the old roof. Not a single car passed. It was past 2 a.m. It didn't even feel like nighttime, more like a hollow space that couldn't be measured. Lucas was still awake, partly from duty, partly because he simply couldn't turn his mind off. He tried to sleep on the makeshift lounge sofa, heart springs under him, the emergency light leaking through a door crack. But every time he closed his eyes, Clara's face would come. And before he could block the thought, the low sound of sobbing drew him from the room, his footsteps echoing softly on the tiles. In the hallway near the ER, he saw her. Clara sat on a low bench, arms wrapped around a weeping woman. The woman was small, dressed in a worn nightgown, probably rushed in from home. Her disheveled hair hid her face. She trembled, choking out words between sobs, mumbling about a son who wouldn't wake up well, fear of fever turning into something worse. Lucas couldn't catch every word, but what lingered in the air was louder than any explanation. Clara hardly said a word. She just sat there, slowly rocking, as if gently soothing the young woman's pain. Every now and then, she murmured that everything was under control, that someone was looking after the boy, that she wasn't alone. Silence itself felt like a kind of embrace, a strange comfort for someone used to analyzing every detail aloud. Lucas leaned against the wall, unnoticed. For the first time in a long time, he chose to stay quiet. He felt he needed to witness that scene, like it was some kind of lesson. Everything else felt far away. His old life, the lawsuits, the rush of court dates, the pride in never showing weakness. That cold metal bench and the mother's red eyes said more than any well-prepared defense. The corridor's yellowish light cast shadows over Clara's face. She looked more fragile, tired, her lab coat crumpled, deep circles under her eyes. Yet she was also stronger than anything around her. Lucas noticed the way she held the woman's hand, gently, unhurried, as if there were no rush to let go. Her gestures were small, almost invisible, but they carried a weight he couldn't quite explain. When the mother stopped crying, she let her head rest on Clara's shoulder the way a child trusts an adult. Lucas felt a strange knot in his chest. Not exactly guilt, but close. A discomfort. Because that night, in that hallway, there was no pretending everything could be reduced to a document tacked to a door, or a number written on a contract. He noticed the hospital, too. During the day it always seemed crowded, chaotic, a mix of disinfectant and burned-out coffee. Now, there was only silence, broken by low voices, the drip of IVs, a radio playing kitschy music from some distant corner. The building was old, yes, but somehow it didn't look so ugly anymore. Maybe it was the way Clara moved through it, picking up dropped blankets, adjusting chairs so the elderly could sleep better, softly asking if anyone wanted some water. Nothing about the place was beautiful, yet there was a kind of beauty in the care itself. Lucas stayed put, not daring to interrupt. For a moment, he let his head rest against the cold wall. He took in the smell, a mix of ether and rain. He shivered, unsure whether it was the late hour or the things he was feeling inside. He thought of his own son, whom he now saw only on weekends, and how, lately, he didn't even know what to ask to make his boy laugh. How many nights had someone else comforted the child just because Lucas was too absent? These thoughts pressed heavier than ever before. Eventually, the mother pulled herself together. Clara helped her up, whispered a few words, maybe promising news soon. They left slowly. Clara lingered on the bench for a moment longer. Only after a few seconds, sensing someone's presence, did she raise her head. Their eyes met in the empty hallway. The hesitation was tangible. Lucas didn't know if he should say something or just leave. The silence between them was charged. There was no pretending that Wall was still standing. Clara looked at him, her gaze lingering as if she were searching for an answer or checking what he had seen. Her face was serious, but not angry. Maybe just exhausted. He hesitated, opened his mouth, then closed it again. No words came. But just then, it didn't feel necessary. The air between them grew heavier, almost solid. Lucas realized he knew nothing about the kind of pain that wandered these corridors, nor the weight Clara carried every day. He didn't know what it meant to be the anchor when someone else was drowning. Up until then, compassion was just something pretty for courtroom speeches, nothing more. Clara broke eye contact first, looking at her hands, straightening her stained lab coat sleeve. The tension eased a little, but lingered. He wanted to say he was learning, that now he understood why this fight mattered so much. He wanted to thank her, even. He couldn't. She said goodbye with a small tilt of her head and walked away, shuffling, her rubber soles squeaking on the floor. Lucas stayed behind. Now, alone, he listened more closely to the hospital's sounds, someone coughing, distant machines beeping. And for the first time, truly, he wanted to listen, not to win a case, but to understand the hopes and aches of those around him. Maybe, he thought, it wasn't just about contracts and concrete walls. Maybe it was about people. In that instant, Lucas knew something inside him had changed quietly, but for good. That hospital break room was anything but charming. Cracked white tile floors, a leaky water filter in the corner, the smell of burnt coffee and powdered milk clinging to the bottom of every mug. It wasn't meant to be a special place. But in those early morning hours, when the small-town clock seemed to vanish, it felt like a shelter where the outside noise grew faint. A soft chill creeped in from the hallways, but it wasn't unpleasant. More like a particular silence, you know? As if the world had pressed pause for 10 minutes. Clara came in, hair messily tied back, a stray strand falling over her cheek. She stirred sugar into her cup, too distracted to remember whether she'd added 2 or 3 spoonfuls. Lucas sat at the table but kept his eyes on the surface, faded red, scratched by anxious hands. He wasn't sure why he'd stayed, when he could be reviewing case files or answering emails from the developer. Maybe he was just tired. Or maybe he needed just a bit of this tired warmth. For a while, they shared only the sound of stirring sugar, metal against ceramic. Clara was the first to break the tension. Sorry, the coffee here's terrible. I always make it too strong. No one complains, though. Everyone's half dead with exhaustion, she said, shrugging, her apology mixed with a nervous laugh. Lucas took a tentative sip. It was bitter, almost burnt. He gave a half smile, rare for anyone who'd seen him in court. It's not that bad. I've had worse, pulling all-nighters at the office. Clara's eyes met his over the rim of her cup. There was a kind of hidden curiosity, a soft challenge. It wasn't just about the coffee, and they both knew it. For a few seconds, nothing was said. They cupped their mugs, warming their hands, as if searching for excuses not to get up, not to end a conversation yet to begin. Lucas realized, suddenly, how different this silence was. He'd sat in rooms packed with lawyers, hearing nothing but his own thoughts shouting in his head. But the break room's silence was something else. It didn't suffocate. It made space for what neither had the courage to say. It was Clara again who gave in. My mom worked here before me. She was a nurse too. Everything I know, I learned watching her on these so-called temporary night shifts that never really end. He could see she was trying to keep it light, but her voice dropped, as if hoping he wouldn't notice. Lucas just nodded, giving her time. He'd never learned much about waiting for others. Life was all sharp answers, counterattacks, but now he only wanted to listen. She was so tired, you know? Almost fell asleep on her feet. I was a kid, sat over there in that corner. She pointed to an old chair tucked away, waiting for her shift to end, listening to her stories. Sometimes she'd cry, but never in front of anyone, only here. Then she'd smile like nothing had happened. The way she spoke, Lucas realized, was just the same, strength, and a sliver of vulnerability, visible only to those who looked closely. He wanted to say something comforting, but no words fit. So he was honest. I lost my son. Not like that. He's alive, he's okay, but it's been a long time since I really saw him. After the divorce, everything got harder. Being away from him feels like I'm missing a piece of my chest. Clara was quiet. She stared at her fingers, and for the first time Lucas noticed her nails, short, bitten from anxiety. She bit her lip, tried to smile, but her face stayed serious. It was an I get it, without a word. The water filter kept dripping, steady. The hospital's rhythm continued outside, a child's muffled cry, a nurse hurrying past, the faint scent of medicine. But time barely seemed to exist in the break room. You know, sometimes it feels like everything that matters happens in here, at this ugly table. I come here to remember who I am. To keep going, even after the worst news, she said, almost whispering. Sometimes I think, if they shut this place down, there won't be a single good memory left of my mom. Lucas felt something tight grow in his throat. In court, he was trained to pull himself back in, close off. Here, all he wanted was to stay. I tried to do everything right, my whole life, he said, looking at his own hands, long, too still, to not miss anything. But now, sometimes it's just not enough. The silence after that was loaded, but not unpleasant. It was as if they finally recognized they were just two tired people, trying not to sink. Clara looked up. Her eyes were brown, but in the cold light appeared lighter. You should call your son. Sometimes, just hearing the voice changes everything. Lucas felt weighed down and hopeful at the same time. He thought of every old excuse, work, schedules, the fear of not knowing what to say. He swallowed hard. I think I could try, he replied. That moment didn't last long, but it went deep. A breath of burnt coffee drifted through. Clara laughed softly, as if setting the room free from some weight. I'll make another, less strong this time, I promise. He lingered a bit, watching the way Clara moved, like she gave meaning to that ugly place. She was everything gentle and worn out the world forgot too quickly. For the first time, Lucas wondered if what he'd been chasing, status, more respect, control, made any sense. What was worth all the effort, if no one was waiting at the end of your shift? Rain returned outside. Lucas hesitated, just for a moment. He wondered if she had already heard the news. If she knew what he'd done the night before, the fight with the client, the threat from the firm. He wanted to apologize, to explain, say anything, but no words felt worthy. She stared right back, tears brimming, her face a swirling mix of pity and pride. Finally, Clara stepped closer. She didn't say thank you, didn't smile. She simply touched his arm, quickly, a gesture that said, we're on the same side now. The halls began to fill. Nurses and doctors arrived one by one. Some traded lab coats for campaign t-shirts. Others brought hand-painted signs of hope, blotched with crooked letters. Kids ran about with bright balloons and eager laughter, maybe trying to forget their fear. Outside, the crowd kept growing. People of all ages, neighbors who only ever met at church festivals, stood there, boots in the mud, sharing umbrellas, holding banners. An old lady made hot coffee in a thermos, passing out cookies since no one knew how long the wait would be. Lucas stepped outside with Clara beside him. He felt every curious glance in his direction, but didn't shrink away. The makeshift courtroom was now the town square. The judge, fresh from the capital, tried to hide his discomfort at the sight of so many ordinary people, folks who never usually fought for anything. The developer's lawyer arrived with a driver, expensive suit, grumpy demeanor. Lucas noticed his hand shook when he opened his briefcase. Inside, Lucas felt a flicker of anger, but also pity. He knew too well what it was to lie awake at night, worrying about reputation, about losing everything. Now, he was the opposite of that. He was fighting for what couldn't be bought. The judge called for silence. The wind rattled the leaves, tossing the last droplets of rain. Time, breath, the future, all seemed suspended. Lucas spoke first. He was no longer the calculating attorney. His voice came out strong, but rough with emotion. He told the truth, the hidden evidence, the hospital's value to the community, the faces of those who needed care, and even those who'd been saved here, without money, with nowhere else to turn. There was a calm anger in his words, an urgency born of fighting with what you've got. While Lucas spoke, Clara tightly held the hand of a little girl beside her. The child wore an oxygen mask, big eyes wide with fear and hope. Clara stroked her head, breathing deeply with every word Lucas said. She knew, from that moment on, nothing would be the same. Not just for her, for everyone there. Every so often, Lucas's eyes met hers, not seeking approval, but looking for strength. And it was there. Her gaze was more than activism, more than duty. It was the complete trust of someone all in. When Lucas finished, silence fell, the kind that chills you, a blend of tension, respect, and waiting. Even the kids stopped playing. Then the developer's lawyer tried to defend his side. Spoke of progress, jobs, taxes. But his words sounded cold, almost robotic. Even he seemed to feel it. The judge called a recess. The townsfolk gathered under trees, in groups, hugging, crying quietly, speaking of hope. Lucas stood by Clara, right in the middle of the square. He realized their hands were almost touching. Instinctively, he didn't move away. Just left them there. As if, together, they could stay warmer, despite the chill. Clara brushed away a tear, embarrassed. She looked at Lucas, honest, vulnerable, a shy smile escaping. He took a long breath, feeling a knot in his throat. He thought about all he'd lost getting here, friends, status, maybe his own name in this place from now on. But he realized that none of them could understand what he felt at this moment. Right then, Lucas wasn't the expensive-suited lawyer scrambling to save himself. He was just a man, eyes tired, betting it all on what, at last, he knew was right. Standing at Clara's side, for the first time he felt the risk was worth it. The future was still a giant question mark. But somehow, that didn't scare him. Not anymore. The rain had stopped. Noise returned little by little, people catching their breath again. Soon they'd find out their fates. The hospital, Clara, Lucas, they'd all hang on one judgment that would shape destinies. But in those suspended minutes, Lucas realized he'd already found what he'd been searching for. Not in law books, not in Sao Paulo's high-rises. It was in Clara's warm hands, the quiet strength of that town square, the weight and stillness of finally being on the right side. It was as though the rain decided to join in the celebration that Friday night. For hours it came and went, gently, timid raindrops, as if even the sky was tired after so many weeks of storms both inside and outside the hospital. The streets smelled of wet earth. In the little square in front of the hospital, the bandstand, crookedly strung with paper flags, sheltered a mess of plastic tables. Children dashed about, an old lady strummed a guitar, and the scent of sweet corn mingled with soup and damp grass. Clara arrived in a soaked blue shirt, hair loose and tangled, a few strands stuck to her forehead. She immediately got to work arranging sweet boxes on the table, smiling as she was hugged by friends whose emotion was palpable in the air. Her eyes shimmered, tired, full of joy kept quiet, and that delicious shock of not having to be strong all the time. Lucas lingered for some minutes under a shop awning, taking it all in from a distance. The sky's dampness dripped from his suit, his shoes were more worn than before, hands in his pockets against the cold or his nerves. He hardly recognized this version of himself, watching from the fringes, not controlling, unsure if he belonged here or was just a stranger who'd stumbled into the scene. But for the first time, that question didn't hurt. It just was. A little girl tugged the hem of his pants, offered him a brigadeiro, and grinned, 2 front teeth missing. He thanked her, a little awkward, and she skipped away. He scanned the plaza. Even those who had spent weeks on edge now clustered together. It was a fragile happiness, still a bit guarded, but real. Clara glanced sideways, and for a moment, Lucas caught her gaze from across the tables. Her smile faltered a second, as if her throat tightened, but it wasn't sadness. Lucas noticed, and his own look sent a quiet warmth across the distance. No words were needed, as if they never would be. He went closer when he saw her shiver. He couldn't tell if it was from the cold or from the day's shock, but he offered her the blanket one of the town's women had draped over his own shoulders. The gesture was simple, quick. Their hands brushed, and he felt a shiver run up the back of his neck. Their eyes met again, amid the bustle. There, in the movement of the celebration, nobody noticed, but anyone paying real attention would have seen everything in that instant. Clara, cheeks flushed pink, nibbling uncertainly at her lips, still unable to speak the words that had been lodged in her throat since the courtroom. Lucas, softer than he'd ever allowed himself to be, searching her eyes for safe harbor and finding it. She grasped one of the colorful ribbons on the table, winding it around her finger, distracted, pretending interest in other people's talk, but every part of her was focused on him. He saw it. It felt strange, this sudden swell of feeling. He was so used to anxiety, calculation, but now there was only presence. The simple wish to stay, to not worry about tomorrow. A heavier rain came, surprising the crowd and sending some scrambling for the shelter of the bandstand. Lucas and Clara remained, standing close, half covered by an improvised canopy, but soaked all the same. He looked at her, joking a little at the absurdity, the water dripping into his eyes. She laughed too, buried her face, a small, unguarded smile found only when all burdens have finally slipped away. Silence fell between them. It had never been like this before. Not that tense hush of early meetings, when her eyes were hard and his defenses colder still. It was a hush full of things waiting for a name. A longing to draw close, to understand, to offer shelter. Every raindrop on the roof marked time in their new rhythm. Lucas wanted to say something, but his chest tightened up. He just looked at her, searching for a sign. Clara trembled slightly, and he, on a sudden impulse, put his arm around her shoulders, this time without fear, without asking too much permission. She let him, buried her face in his chest and sighed. Inside, it felt like everything stopped. He thought of how many times he'd been called cold, a machine, a coward. Realized how much he'd changed, not out of fear of losing, but this time out of fear he might never feel that way again. A good kind of fear, a word impossible to explain. People were laughing, shouting, organizing bingo at the other end of the square. But right there it felt like only the two of them existed, breathing together for the very first time. Clara closed her eyes. She breathed in his scent, mixed with the smells of night, wet clothes, hospital, strange, comforting. There was no need to ask if it was real. She just knew. Under his breath, Lucas wondered if she wanted to run away with him, if that embrace was a yes. He hardly thought of the consequences. For the first time, he didn't want to win anything. He just wanted to be there. Just keep going, with her. His hands slid gently down and interlaced their fingers atop the damp blanket. She smiled, eyes still closed, and finally whispered, just for him, "Thank you for staying." His face grew hot. He answered only by squeezing her hand, firm. Nothing more was needed. Deep down, they both knew. Everything that mattered had already been said. The rest could wait. All around them, the city wrapped itself in an embrace again. But on their skin, in the silence of those minutes, it was as if the storm no longer existed. You know that nice emptiness after a long fight? Not the weary kind, but the quiet calm of someone who's breathed out the last breath of a storm. That's how Lucas woke up, that strangely cool morning for a small country town, as if all the weight had leaked out across the old floor of his makeshift room at the inn. He felt he might have fallen asleep with a smile at last. His mind still scribbled a few little doubts. Now what? What to do with the rest of life? But his chest was just lightness. Outside, the town seemed to breathe differently, too. The smell of fresh bread from the market mixed with the scent of flowers, and now he noticed it, something he used to let pass him by. The phone rang from time to time. Messages, calls, from Sao Paulo, from old colleagues. The offer to come back to the big law firm, praise for having done a good job, even if you lost in the end. The past pushing at the present, relentlessly, the kind of pressure that would have paralyzed Lucas before. He looked at the names on the screen, feeling almost nothing. In the kitchen, the black coffee tasted better. Maybe it was the gentle way Mrs. Teresa stirred in the sugar, smiling shyly when he said thanks. Lucas realized he didn't miss the rushed coffee of the big cafes or the traffic outside the window. The silence here had a different sound. At the hospital, Clara's hair was tied up the way that leaves a few stray wisps skimming her forehead. He noticed that before anything else, before any paperwork or obligations, she was speaking quietly to an old lady waiting at reception, explaining a new medicine. The calm sparkle in her eyes, the smile of someone who's already cried but is still ready to try again. Lucas just stood there, watching, not sure whether to walk in or just wait. When they finally met each other's eyes, it wasn't like before. No knot in the stomach from arguments, no fear of saying the wrong thing. There was a kind of peace. She smiled softly, and he just nodded, as if to say, "I'm here." It was Clara who asked for help organizing the equipment room. It looked like nothing much, but they both knew what it meant, a way to start over, to bring a little order after the legal chaos that had taken over that place. Lucas put on a makeshift lab coat, laughed at his reflection, felt strange seeing his own arms shifting boxes, labeling saline bottles while Clara explained patiently which shelf was for gauze, which for inhaler medicine. Sometimes, silence was thick with meaning. It was as if every gesture, the passing of a box, the accidental quick touch of a finger against his hand, said, "I see you here, by my side, no matter what you did before." At the end of the morning, the two of them met Daniel, the boy who pretended to be brave just so his grandma wouldn't worry. He asked for Clara's power hug, and she did even better. She called Lucas over as well. The three of them stood there, a little awkward, laughing, until the boy got the courage to go up for his exam alone. Lucas felt a different, warm knot rising from his stomach to his chest. Something he'd never felt in the cold corridors of the courthouses. That boy's fragile trust felt like a gift he'd never expected he could deserve. When the rain came, thin, lazy, Lucas didn't run for cover. On the contrary, he let his dress shirt get wet, a small smile breaking out when he realized just how strange this was for him. Clara appeared at the emergency room door, holding a colorful umbrella. She just looked at him without saying anything, but laughed that way where her eyes crinkle up. At lunch, the whole little town seemed to revolve around a long table, cobbled together in the hospital hallway. Mrs. Marlene, Mr. Osmar, the neighborhood kids. Simple food, seasoned beans, steaming rice. Lucas sat among everyone, listening to stories he didn't completely understand. But the strangest thing was how he didn't feel out of place at all. People asked his name, laughed at the jokes, piled his plate without a second thought. Even Clarinia, Luciana's newborn, ended up in his arms, big hands, a little awkward but gentle. Everybody watching, as if a man that size rocking a tiny bundle was the spectacle of the year. Nobody talked about the weeks of struggle. Nobody mentioned lawsuits, court orders. It was just daily life, just life happening. Lucas took a piece of bread and wondered, from the inside out, how long had it been since he felt like this? This simple thing, belonging. At the end of the day, more offers came in on his phone. High-ranking position, outrageous salary, car, apartment, time to get things back to normal. But his hand didn't want to press the button to accept. He left the phone on the windowsill, the glow of the screen fading. The hospital's sound was different. Hurried footsteps, quiet laughter, a radio playing some old music. The strangest thing, the more time passed, the less he wanted to be that other Lucas again. The one in the expensive suits, speaking in big words. In Clara's face, Lucas found no expectation, no doubt. Only the look of someone who knows how to wait. Who's lost, started over many times, and never grows tired. When she walked past him, her fingers brushed his shirt sleeve. Not a hug, not a long touch. But his heart sped up anyway. Because sometimes, starting over is like that, a small, nearly invisible gesture. Before leaving, Lucas stood looking at the hospital door, night already fallen, yellow light spilling across the sidewalk. The cold hillside wind on his face. He thought of his son, far away, and wanted to bring him here someday. To show him this simpler life, this place where you can just be. Because, in that quiet early evening, Lucas realized that for the first time he didn't need to leave. The hard part was admitting that finally, he wanted to stay. I still remember that late afternoon as if it were yesterday. The square was almost empty, just an old man walking his dog and a few kids making a fuss near the fountain. The sky, half orange, half still blue, gave everything that blurry, slow-motion feel. That's where I saw Lucas, completely different from the stiff lawyer who'd first arrived from the city, looking down his nose. He sat beside me on the old wooden bench, worn by time, and stayed quiet. Neither of us said a word for a while, and to be honest, I didn't even want words. The silence with him had a different color. Not the sharp-edged silence of judgment, or the awkward silence of our first conflict at the hospital. This was almost like a hug. My chest felt so full I could barely breathe, but I didn't want to break that spell. Every now and then a cool breeze would blow, making the hem of my dress flutter. Lucas noticed things like that, and this time didn't pretend not to. He'd always pretended, hadn't he? His whole life, I think. Pretending nothing hurts, nothing matters, everything's just fine. But that afternoon, he was just there. Suit jacket tossed in the car, sleeves rolled up, hands interlaced over his knee, that look of exhaustion and relief mixed together. He was the one who broke the ice. You know, I never understood why people like being in the square so much. He smiled crookedly, that kind of grin that only appears when someone catches themselves feeling vulnerable. I laughed too, eyes still on the fountain, answering softly, it's the only place where time really stops, if only for a few minutes. He looked sideways at me. I wanted so much to rest my head on his shoulder, but I just sat there, arms crossed, afraid to cross the line between what was possible and what wasn't. The bench creaked when we moved. A few birds sang, distracted by the kids' racket. And in that such a simple scene he spoke, almost in a whisper, Clara, I don't know how to go back to who I was. I can't. And fell silent again. I wasn't sure if I should say anything. Maybe he just needed to get that out. But on the inside, it felt like it would all well up until I burst if I kept quiet. Nobody does, Lucas. I can't be who I was before you came here either. After all this, the fight. I'm not just a nurse anymore. This town has changed. You've changed. His eyes filled with tears, but he hid it by dropping his head, fumbling nervously with his watch, sort of lost between the present and the past. The wind picked up, bringing the smell of wet grass our way. I closed my eyes for a deep breath. I was afraid he'd leave. That, after everything, his courage would just disappear. But then I felt his warm hand covering mine, shaky, uncertain. Lucas's hand never felt like the hand of a famous lawyer, at least not how I used to imagine. It was warm, nervous, with discreet calluses, signs of someone who'd held the world alone for too long. Neither of us spoke again. He just stayed there, feeling my hand. Anyone passing by on the street would never notice, but for us it was a revolution. He broke the silence again. I thought winning was everything. All these years, every line of every contract, every word memorized. And in the end, I lost the case. Lost my career. Lost even my colleagues' respect. But I found you. Here I found peace. It's strange to say, isn't it? I looked at him, so close, afraid it all might vanish in a second, like a beautiful illusion. So much pain just to get there. So many things lost, rebuilt, discovered by surprise. I wanted to cry. I wanted to laugh. But he turned very slowly, resting his forehead on mine. The warmth there was enough. No more winter, no lawsuits, no big city. Just him, just me, just this old bench. The hug came so naturally, nobody even noticed when it began. We stayed like that for a long time. He leaned in closer, his heart pounding, almost like an apology and a promise to start over together. I breathed deep, trying to memorize that scent, that feeling of finally fitting somewhere. It's not just another square, just another bench. It's not just a saved hospital. It's like every brick of this place, every windblown leaf, every laughing child is a witness to how our whole lives turned around. Not because it was easy, God. The pain was real, the loss is heavy, but for the first time, the silence wasn't fear. It was home. We stayed there until the cold called for a jacket. We spoke little, but said it all. Small dreams, big plans, the will to put down roots, not to run away. He thought out loud. I never imagined I'd have the guts for this. To stay. To start over. Here. I didn't answer, just squeezed his hand tighter. The sky dimming, streetlights popping on one by one, and he had that look of a kid, lost but happy. I realized Lucas had never really had a home. And now, right there in that forgotten square, together, we'd found one. Deep down, I knew it wasn't the hospital or the lawsuits or even the town. It was what he'd finally let himself open up to. It was where his heart, at last, decided to stay.